I am very pleased to introduce to you tonight Mr. Andrew Eiva, whose reputation preceded him. I heard about him a couple of times from being friends with Lydia before I actually had the chance to speak with him on the phone. He lives in Washington, D.C. Is originally, do you mind if I read this a little bit? Was born in Lithuania. Was born of refugee parents who fled tyranny in Lithuania and learned early on that resistance warfare could help his homeland, Lithuania, regain independence. His quest took him to West Point and the Green Berets. He is best known for his impact on policy and the selection of effective weapon systems during Afghanistan's struggle against Red Army occupation. Later in Lithuania, he led the volunteer pro-independence forces in a showdown with Soviet occupation forces. I'm told that the founder of Christendom College, Warren Carroll, actually gave a talk titled Andrew Eiva and the Fall of the Soviet Empire. So when I Googled Mr. Eiva, I certainly saw many links that were crediting him with a lot of play in that the fall of the Soviet Empire. So that's kind of really cool. During Serb ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, he lobbied for military support for the Bosnians and Kossovars, and recently he helped to found the Sudan Committee with the help of several friends. And I suspect we're going to be hearing about that tonight. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Eiva.
I'll pick up exactly where Angela left off, where several friends asked me to found the Freedom for Sudan Committee. Well, the friends were the Bible study group that meets every Saturday in the basement of Immaculate Conception Cathedral, the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington. Our Bible study leader is a Baptist, but they said, Andrew, you're always complaining about what America is doing in Sudan. Why don't you do something about that? And I said, I'm burnt out. This wrecks your finances. This wrecks your family life. It wrecks your health. And I don't have it in me to do it anymore. And they said, we'll volunteer. We'll back you up. And we'll, if you get involved. So they sucked me into it. That was 2006, but that's not what the story is about, and I'm very glad Philip Aguat came from Manchester here tonight. Philip, there were a series of genocides conducted against the Black Sudanese by the racist Khartoum regime. It's an Arab or Arabized racist regime. The millions of people were killed. By the best conservative estimates, which is not the ones that are being published, 5 million were killed. Possibly that 10 million were killed. Good statistics weren't kept. In Philip's case, his father was murdered as part of the genocide, and as well as his brother and sister. 2 out of his 6 brothers and sisters were killed. So it's personal, it's real, and it's serious. The Awil tribe, which is the largest single tribe in South Sudan, which is Philip's tribe, is 95% Catholic. And they started with 6 million people, population, give or take, when the genocides began in 1955. 2 million of those 6 million were killed by the first 2 genocides, the first one starting in 55 and the second one starting in 83. And another 1 million women and children were enslaved and taken north or elsewhere to be converted to Islam and to be slaves in Arabized households. So that's a big loss. And right now the Awil are down to about 3 million. So even though South Sudan has won its independence, let me just sort of do a little pretend geography here. Think of this as Sudan, up and down, and the north under Khartoum's occupation, and Awil does the borderline tribe right here between North Sudan and South Sudan. So the drive by the Khartoum regime to slaughter black people concentrated much of its force on the Awil right here. But the Awil did suffer the most of the South Sudan tribes as a percentage of their people being killed. But they also inflicted the greatest amount of casualties on the northern forces and fought them to a draw to enable peace between the North and South in 2005. The Awil are reputed to be the best dancers, which I would verify, having visited them in Syracuse. And I've got to learn the Awil people, even though I was trying to become an expert on Sudan. I learned about the Dinka tribe, but the Awil are the major part of the Dinka tribe, and I just started learning them in the last 3 or 4 months. The Awil community in Syracuse, in Rochester, in Buffalo, have been swinging into action to lobby to recruit members of Congress to the Sudan caucus. The Awil tribe, even though it represents maybe 20% or 10% of the Sudanese community in the United States, they represent 50% of the organized Sudanese effort in the United States. Why? Because they're coherent in their family lives and their communities, and they stick together and they make things happen. And I had an experience about a month ago starting to work with them. And at first it was very slow. I thought, boy, this is not going to work at all. Language differences, cultural differences. And I gave instructions to the Rochester community, the Syracuse committee, and the Buffalo community what they should do, and nothing's being followed. And I said, boy, this is not going to work. Within about 3 days, they came up with their own plans, which fit their own communities and congressmen better than what I had in my brilliance figured out. And suddenly, congressmen are being pushed, and Dan Maffei of Syracuse became the first congressman to sign on to the Sudan caucus as a result of the Awil community about 4 weeks ago. So our neighbor, and people doing violence in the name of God have done one hell of a lot of damage in our religion and other religions. But in the case of liberating the oppressed, this is a tremendous potential weapon to use. Before Afghanistan, the CIA had supported 12 resistance movements, including my own native Lithuania, fighting against tyranny. All 12 were betrayed, destroyed, and eventually abandoned. Millions of the most courageous, freedom-loving people in the world were annihilated. And the CIA's performance was so bad that what I used to say is they should have been on Soviet payroll, not ours, for what they did. Thanks to the rebellion of Senator Paul Tsongas in the Senate, Gordon Humphrey after him, and the other people who offered a lot for the Afghan cause, we broke the spell at number 13. The Afghans won, covert operation number 13. But now, the United States, State Department and others are using diplomacy to divide the resistance in the north of Sudan. There is no talk of arming or supporting the Sudanese resistance, which, with effective aid, could win this war in several months and end 57 years of genocide. Just to show what effective aid can do, Stinger missiles were the most effective. Angela mentioned I was involved in the selection of effective weapons. If you Google my name with Stingers knocked down 700 Soviet aircraft in Afghanistan in 2 years. The Khartoum Air Force has 70 operating aircraft. Just think, we knocked down 10 Khartoum Air Forces in 2 years with Stinger missiles. So if we were to provide Stinger missiles to the Sudanese resistance, it would be over. The aircraft bombers and gunships that are strafing and bombing and creating starvation and destruction in northern Sudan are the backbone of the genocide. There are other ground forces, they're important. But the Air Force, the air power is the important part. So we designed a strategy, which the AWIL have contributed to recruit. We're doing some inside baseball. We're on the Foreign Affairs Committee. When let me back up a second. There's 42 Black Caucus members right now in the House of Representatives, so that's what we're really focusing on. There's only 13 of them are in the Sudan Caucus. We believe if all 42 of them can be convinced that this is a racist genocide, they will be a powerful force in Congress and hard to stop to provide effective aid to the Sudanese resistance to win their freedom. We have some proof of that would work. We'd had a good session with one Black Caucus member, Karen Bass, who was appointed by the Black Caucus to handle the Sudan issue for them. And we had a meeting with her. And in the first 35 minutes of the meeting, she was convinced of the racist basis for this genocide. And by the end of the meeting, she was talking about Stinger missiles. That's one congressman. And she is being blocked by Ed Royce of California, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And we're trying to mobilize Chris Smith, who's normally with us on this. He's the chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, by the way. So he's Karen Bass's partner. She's the minority leader. He's the majority leader of the Africa Committee. But so far, Chris Smith's staff, I believe, unbeknownst to him, is not supporting this hearing. But I think we'll break through that. So that's one front we're working on. And there's another committee, something like that is going on too. We won't get into that. But so what I would like to ask you, if you can, you have two congresswomen here, Carolyn Shea Porter, I believe, and Ann Custer. I'm not familiar with either of them. Neither of them is on the Sudan Caucus. And we want to create a drumbeat out there that will overcome all the deep forces of the establishment that are mobilized to prevent a reversal of the U.S. policy of complicity and acquiescence in the genocide of Sudanese blacks. Just as one example, before wrapping up, just to the degree of complicity going on in Washington and in the establishment. The most important force to end the genocide, as we've just mentioned, is the resistance, potential force. Two journalists covered this in the Washington Post 2 years ago, Stephanie McCrummen, Craig Timber. They both lost their jobs after covering that. In the New York Times, Lydia Polgren covered that story about 2.5 years ago, the resistance resisting. She was moved to New Delhi. Since those three reporters lost their jobs, no other reporter in those two newspapers has covered even the existence of the Sudanese resistance. Why haven't you heard of it? That's why. There's a tremendous resistance that has won an enormous set of battles in the north of Sudan, fighting back against this genocide. And with the right empowerment, they could end this genocide, bring freedom to that land, and start rebuilding, and let the serious work of rebuilding that country begin. Thank you very much for your time. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
What is the motivating factor why there's a resistance to
Helping resistance movements?
There has to be some motivation.
It's different. That is one heck of a question, and I've struggled. I've written my Republican platform testimony in 1984, which is available on Jezail.org. Jezail, Jezail.org, has a number of PDF documents on that website, and one of them is my Republican platform testimony, which spells this out in detail, but I'll give you a quick rundown. Each bureaucracy, a general answer, each bureaucracy, State Department, Pentagon, and the CIA benefit from large operations, large counterinsurgents, control business. They're in the control business. They're not in the freedom business. And they're in the spending business, not in the saving business. So those bureaucracies find themselves far more comfortable investing $1 trillion and 3,000 American lives in occupying in Iraq instead of 10 years earlier supporting the Iraqi resistance with less than $1 billion. So billion and $1 trillion is a big difference in these days of sequester. By the way, sequester is going to help us because we're going to have to be forced, and this is where a little further down the line, your Senator Ayotte, who's influential on the Armed Services Committee, if she can be convinced of the value of supporting resistance movements as opposed to just writing checks for whatever the Pentagon is asking, that will help tilt the way to what we want for the Sudanese resistance. But in the case of the Pentagon, for example, resistance warfare is done with mostly with second-hand weapons. It would take 200 Stinger missiles to knock out the Sudanese Air Force. That would cost, training, everything put together, $24 million. What profits $24 million? That's chump change in the Pentagon when you can spend $10 billion on this and $20 billion on that. There's no interest in it. That's what it comes down to. The money's not there, the power's not there, the control is not there when you empower other people to be free. But it is the best thing that could happen to the United States. Let me do the reverse on that to go on a little bit. Why is it our interest? When we finally did support for the first time the Afghan resistance effectively, even though we betrayed them behind the scenes at the end, which opened the way to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but even so, 15 countries, including my native Lithuania, the Soviet power was broken and 15 countries went free. And a wave of prosperity came across the world with globalization and the internet and so forth. $100 trillion in new wealth was created in the world, 40 trillion of it here in the United States, as globalization, the internet, and the free markets to play their way. But the Afghan sacrifice opened the way to that freedom. Even in a country like India, which had modeled its whole economy on the Soviet command economy model, when Moscow disappeared Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, their model disappeared. They turned to the free market, and they created 20 trillion in new wealth in India, and 300 million people moved into the middle class. So supporting the cause of freedom with $1 billion created or contributed to, it didn't create it all, the internet helped, globalization, free markets, and all those things came together, but they contributed to the creation of 100 trillion. As a matter of fact, a lot of these Catholic colleges, I don't know, when was Thomas More founded? 1976. That's older. A number of the Christian colleges around the country, or Catholic colleges, Thomas Aquinas and Kristen were older, but a majority of the newer one, the wave of new one, when was the University of Dallas founded? What year?
1956.
Oh boy, I'm not finding the right example. I should have been better loaded. A lot of Catholic schools did open up after 91 in this wave of wealth that came across the United States with the fall of the Soviet Empire, and it created a lot more opportunities to expand and grow even our own Catholic education by getting some of the crumbs beneath the table of this great wealth that was being created by freedom. So there's yes, they really have an interest in empowering people fighting for their freedom and winning freedom.
Are there other reasons, like, say, natural resources in certain countries, or just a general, say, bias towards stability instead of freedom fighters, or disruptions, whether it's, all these places that it's happened all over the world, whether we have vital interests as a country there or not? Is it sometimes easy to say there's resources there that we want, or we don't want someone else to get? Or is it more than just billions or trillions of dollars through a federal agency?
Yes, it is much more. You're hitting the nail on the head there. The worst governments in the world, like Iran, Sudan, Pakistan, put between those three countries close to $100 million is being put via K Street or K Street lobby groups to reinforce the tendencies of the State Department, CIA, and Pentagon to support incumbent regimes for stability. And in the case of these genocidal or oppressive countries who fear the human rights passions of Congress and the American people, but they find it wise to invest tens of millions of dollars to sidetrack those human rights passions, whether they occur in Congress or the grassroots, to prevent them, and hence the removal of those journalists I mentioned earlier. So that's the worst, that's the point of the spirit of the evil. Then there's a general status quo orientation too, that reinforces that on a broader level. Saudi Arabia is a mixed bag. It has some positive and bad things, and they pay a lot of money in Washington too. But the core of it is, I would say, those three countries that I mentioned, all two of which are running genocides. Pakistan is running a genocide against the Baluch people. Khartoum is running a genocide against the Black Sudanese.
Question for him. I'm going to ask you to take the opposite side, your opposition, to answer the question. But let me set up the question first.
Okay.
So you're going to be talking against yourself, really. If you look at the Americas wars, the Revolution or the Civil War, both major leaders there, General Washington needed a win to start bringing people over and getting the support for him. Abraham Lincoln needed to win some battles. When things were going poorly, he needed to win some battles desperately to sway the public opinion toward the war and support it. If it would take 24 million to support the Sudanese with the Stinger missiles, let's double that, 50 million. And you say that's small money in the whole Pentagon budget. What would be the opposition then to spending the 50 million, win the Sudanese war, chalk that one up in the win column, and go on to something else?
In a public fight, that I think that opposition would collapse like a house of cards. We need the oomph to create the public fight. I'm not on salary for this.
I guess what I'm asking is, it seems somewhat, and it's a lot more complicated than that, but it seems somewhat simple.
No, it is somewhat simple.
If you're
It's
spending
extremely
trillions
simple.
and trillions to go sustain a war, why not spend a small amount of that to actually win a war? And we've got into the Vietnam conflict for 10 years or more than that.
We were on the opposite side, so we ended up spending 40 to 80 billion a year,
Right.
while the communists were the Soviets and others were spending 5 million a year to kill our people.
So
That was done to us in
Yeah.
Vietnam.
if we were to be able to go back in time and say, if you spent a little bit more money in Vietnam and just went in there and absolutely annihilated the enemy and won the war, you would have a lot better public opinion of the Vietnam War than what we have today. So I guess what I'm asking, in Sudan, what would the opposition be to going in there, spending the 50 million or 24 million to win the war, and then go on to something else? And then you wouldn't even have this.
The opposition I can give you specifically the opposition that has taken place when people have made hesitant pushes in that direction. We have not had a serious push for stingers. As a matter of fact, at the conference there was a conference in Northern Virginia this past weekend, where for the first time stingers managed to dominate the activist conference. Up to that point, the leadership of the activist movement had managed to keep stingers off the table of the discussion. But in the last hearing in which this was brought up, Princeton Lyman, the special envoy on Sudan, was confronted by one congressman who said, why not provide airstrikes to help the resistance? Now, airstrikes are a little more expensive. The no-fly zone in Libya cost us $500 million a week, so that's expensive compared to the Stinger purchases. Nevertheless, at least it was something. And Princeton Lyman said, that'll make things worse. They'll just start using artillery on the Sudanese, which was ridiculous on the face of it. I think anybody can recognize that as a ridiculous answer by Princeton Lyman. But no congressman felt confident enough to jump on him right after that answer. So people are confused. And I managed to talk to Congressman Capuano, who's from Massachusetts, not far away, who is one of the leaders of the Sudan movement in Congress. And I said to him, listen, it's not that, some of these discussions we had here, it's not that difficult. We could arm them, we could provide air defense. And Capuano looks burnt out at me with burnt out eyes. He's a passionate, honest person, I truly believe that. But he looks at me, you know, Andrew, that we just don't have quite the stomach for it here. Well, we got to create the stomach for it. One of the problems in Capuano's case, as is the case of many good congressmen, including Chris Smith, the same, is that what I call the 70%ers. This is a little inside baseball, but it's good stuff. 70%, what I nicknamed the 70%ers. 70% of the active congressmen on an issue which confronts State Department priorities end up being more loyal to the State Department than to the congressman who is paying their salaries. Why? That's kind of wild. In Capuano's place, that's Christina Safoulias. In Chris Smith's case, it's Greg Simpkins and Sherry Rickard. And these 70%ers see that their future income and career depends on the good feelings of the State Department and will manipulate their member in order to advance the policies of the State Department. I said this publicly for the first time about 5 days ago. It's a fairly paranoid theory, and if I get shot next week, you'll know why. But I'm 64 years old. Bring it on. As a matter of fact, I'll take a little aside on. I was in a Bible study group in the Capitol, room HC8, had a weekly Wednesday Bible study. I was there, and Karen Bass had just made the commitment to have this wonderful hearing that I mentioned earlier. And I asked the Bible study group to pray for the success of this hearing. And one of the members in the Bible study who was on the Foreign Affairs Committee says, Andrew, you have to understand that the people on the Foreign Affairs Committee don't work for their congressman, they work for the State Department. And when that was told to me, because I had always suspected this, but I was always nervous about sounding too paranoid to say it publicly. But when I got that confirmation sitting around the table of a Bible study in the Capitol from a Foreign Affairs Committee staffer, that was a big step for me. It still took me about 3 or 4 months before I had the nerve to go a little public. It's not very public, but that's.
Do you have evidence? Well, I would think you could prove this or have more convincing evidence of congressional staffers who went on to work for the State Department when their congresspersons they got unelected or afterwards.
Even without working for the State Department, you work in NGOs or private volunteer organizations, and names are blacklisted who are critical of the State Department. And it is known in Washington, don't rock the boat on this stuff. a salary exceeding $22,000. Is that it? Did I answer that question?
Is there a political reason why the State Department would not want to move forward with that?
No, it's more institutional. The most educational document, it's online, about the State Department is it's the title of it is, if you Google the phrase acquiescence of this government, if you Google that, those are the first lines of a document written by 3 Christian Treasury Department officials exposing how the CIA was lying and suppressing information about the Holocaust in Europe and how they were blocking efforts to rescue. And these 3 feisty Treasury Department low-ranking guys wrote this memo, 19-page memo, and hammered the State Department for lies and duplicity that you wouldn't believe. That when it was brought to President Roosevelt, this document was brought to President Roosevelt. At that point, Breckinridge Long, this leading State Department official in charge of this blockage, was marginalized, and a policy to rescue Jews was adopted, and 250,000 Jews were saved towards the end of the Holocaust. The new funds were created. Raoul Wallenberg got hired by these new funds. Monsignor Roncalli, who later became Pope John the 23rd, was empowered as a prelate in Istanbul to rescue Jews by this fund, and many others. So when you can, one of the powers that we have, and one of the powers that they fear, I've seen what an explosion human rights passion can do when government duplicity exposed. I've seen it on Afghanistan, I've seen it on Bosnia. This is a huge thing. It doesn't last very long, and if we don't capture that well and turn it into a good policy, we will blow it. But if it's captured, a moral explosion is possible. It's happened several times in our history, and it can change this policy. Yes, sir.
Why did we go with the no-fly zone in Libya instead of stingers?
Stingers, I don't think were discussed as an option, to my knowledge. Stingers are a little bit frightening to people. There's a lot of Pentagon propaganda out there, how dangerous it could be used by terrorists. The thousands of stingers we delivered in Afghanistan, not one has been used in a terrorist incident. But in Libya, even in Libya, there was opposition to helping altogether. The massacre in Benghazi, there were 3 gutsy career officials, the 3 wonderful Democratic babes, Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, and Samantha Power. They hit hard on President Obama to say, Gaddafi has promised the massacre of Benghazi. We must move, and they came up with a scenario of how to move fast, and it was pulled off by those 3 people, only one of whom is, one of whose career was destroyed, one of whom is left, and one of whom, Samantha Power, is still hanging on at the White House. No, she's at the State Department. So people who do this lose or end their career one way or the other, but it's worth it. Yes, sir.
So you work with a lot of Republicans and Democrats. I know you're also a pro-life Catholic. Would you say that anyone can clearly state that one party is evil and the other one isn't?
I come close to that. I come close to that. If you were to peel the skin off here, I bet I'm to the right of everybody in this room. But I've also found the idealistic passions of the Democrats on this type of thing a crucial asset if it's empowered properly that can help carry the day. Of the Sudan caucus of 61 members, 48 are Democrats. Only 1 is a Tea Party member. that guy, good God, I forget, the guy who yelled, "You lie," that guy from South Carolina. And I've been pushing actually for get Republicans on the Sudan caucus, but the fact that you have 2 Democrats, get them on the Sudan caucus and tell them that this is a racist genocide. I want that word racist genocide in there. I want it coming from every direction. We can prove it, and the proof has been written, but it's still not picked up in the mainstream media. The only place that has carried an article on the mainstream genocide is in the New Amsterdam News, which is the African identity newspaper published in Harlem. They're the only ones who have carried an article explicitly describing and laying out the basis, the racist basis for the genocide in Sudan.
Follow-up question then. Why hasn't that phrase gotten bigger play in the black community?
We only started promoting it ourselves. We spent 4 or 5 years curing our stupidity and ignorance until we started figuring out what it's going to take to make this thing work. And last year was when we started emphasizing it. We organized a delegation. We went up to Philadelphia. The person I think is the top African identity scholar in the United States, Molefi Asante, who directs the Black Studies Center at Temple University. And we explained to him why we think it's a racist genocide. He knew a lot more than we did, but it helped energize it to put it together. And he's the one who published the article in New Amsterdam News that is one of our key weapons right now. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you. One of the first theology tests I'm going to do a lot of research on. I mean, about half of it that I understand. Again, thank you all for coming. We're going to do our raffle here for who won the bottle of wine. If you didn't get a chance